Encounter Talks with Dawn at Gessner Ministries, a forum for discussing challenging topics, dissecting truth, discovering hope and light in a world that desperately needs revival.
Hey, Wes, it's good to see you today.
Thank you.
And I can't believe it. It's already time for our second video podcast that we're doing together. And I wanted to just right up front say to anyone that is watching the video podcast, whether it's the Wednesday or when you're doing the sermon, or if it's Friday when we're doing this Encounter Talks, that if they have any comment or a question, we would love to receive those and make it part of the video podcast when we do the Encounter Talks on a Friday. So hopefully that can happen, and they can always go back after today and revisit the sermon by going to MidWeekEncounter.com. And so anyway, I hope that a lot of people will do that as soon as we finish up what we're talking about today. So the sermon that you gave on Wednesday was about the Lord is my shepherd. And right away when you had begun, you were talking about this illustration about this little boy, and it was intriguing to me because he couldn't memorize it. He was having a difficult time, and finally his conclusion was that why did he need to memorize it? Because all he needed to know was the Lord is my shepherd. So, and that reminded me a long time ago now, V.H. Lewis, the general superintendent emeritus for the Church of the Nazarene. Of course, he's dead now, but he was at a general assembly in Indianapolis, and he presented a theme that for the church to use for the coming year, and it was God first. And I just thought, man, it all gets reduced. It's just that simple. We don't need anything else. It's just God. But anyway, the sermon you shared on Wednesday had 3 points. I always liked the alliteration you use because it helps me to know exactly what it is, and I can remember it a little bit better in my old age, that is. Anyway, it was rescue and rejoice, then reassurance, and finally reward. So Wes, for me, I think a lot of what you shared was about God's attitude toward us. And when I think of that, I really think of grace, because it's hard to define grace. And yet I think that's probably the best definition of grace that there is. It's God's attitude toward us. But anyway, I want you to just talk about those 3 points, if you would, and we'll just have some dialogue about it.
Okay. Well, it's fascinating to me that the narrative of God being a shepherd is all through the Bible. It starts in Genesis, as I said in the message, with Jacob having Joseph, or Isaac, having Joseph, I should say, in front of him with his 2 grandchildren, and he wanted to bless them. And so he did that in Genesis 48 and said, he's the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this very day. Mm-hmm. And so when you start applying the characteristics of a shepherd, you've got to understand that that's why in Genesis or Isaiah or the Psalms or other places, as they looked around them, and this is really way more than we can get into today, but as they looked around them in these biblical times, the best example, and I'm sure there were bad shepherds, which is why David wrote, what we refer to him as the good shepherd. But a good shepherd was so loving and so graceful and so kind and so caring for their sheep that that's the metaphor that they were using all the way back into Genesis. So it didn't start with Psalm 23. So I just took that and felt like, based on the several little illustrations that Jesus used or others writing about it, that here are three things out of 100 things or more that you could say the good shepherd or the shepherd does. And the first one for me is always starts with the rescue and the rejoicing, meaning that the illustration Jesus gave is that if a man has 100 sheep, the good shepherd will leave the 99 and go out and search for the one that's lost. And we know that narrative, most of us do, because the Father is not willing that even any of these little ones should perish. And that's a huge piece of grace. And of course, the follow-up to that story is in another gospel is that the shepherd will come rejoicing with the little lamb, and he'll call everybody else to rejoice with him. The second one was that he's the shepherd who gives reassurance, and that has to do, based on scripture in John chapter 10, that says he calls them by name, he leads them out, he walks ahead of them, they follow him because they know his voice, they won't follow a stranger, they'll run from him because they don't know his voice. And again, he says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep. That's repeated all through that John 10 passage. And Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them. They follow me. I give them life that lasts forever. And so that's one of incredible, great reassurance. And God's probably, he's done that over and over for all these kind of different people that I mentioned throughout the Old Testament, both successes and failures. People that failed God, but also people that were very, very successful before God and walked a straight line. But I think it's he always is looking, he's always searching, he's always reassuring those who need the reassurance the most. And then the last one was he's a shepherd who will reward us. And that's based out of 1 Peter, where Peter is talking to the shepherds, as in human pastors, and following, caring for the flock like God has cared for them. And it's all to receive that never ending glory and crown and honor. And so he is a God that also rewards in the end as a shepherd.
Yeah. I was thinking when I was listening to the message, especially on the point of the rescue and the rejoicing that's part of that rescue. I think for me, so often it feels like, and this is just a little different take, but so often it feels like we hold up as an example, so the person who has gone the farthest or has done the worst things ever, and there is not the focus lots of times on the person who very early on in his life just made a decision to follow Christ and has followed him from that time on, and just, there's not the spectacular with that sometimes. So it feels like the example most often that we gravitate to is the one of who's done such horrible things in his life.
Right. And in fact, that first illustration of the sheep that got lost and got caught in a thicket or whatever was over the cliff. And I bring up images of people coming to the church and doing chalk drawings of the great shepherd rescuing the sheep. For those of you who don't know what that is, you can look it up later. And the song 90 and 9 playing in the background. I don't know. That's just a short relapse into my past.
Well, we all have a past.
Yeah. But now I lost my train of thought. So the idea of that, Don, is, we automatically think about the big stories, the big failures. I'm not sure the lamb knew that they were trying to get away from the shepherd. They just fell into a thicket. Mm-hmm. I do think that all of us need rescued from time to time. And I know theologians will wrestle with that. You do sin or you don't sin after you become a Christian.
Sure.
Jesus sees it or he doesn't see it, whatever. And I'm not talking about that, but I think the way revivals get started, and that's in the opener to this Encounter Talks, the need for the church to have revival. It's because Jesus rescues someone, not necessarily because they're in sin, but because they've drifted away from God. One of the favorite memories that I have of being in a church that my dad pastored in Waverly, Ohio, and I don't think it happened all the time, but I remember it happened. And I remember Chuck Milhoff talking about this with somebody in Chicago First Church, of the same kind of thing happening. I remember on a Sunday morning when one of the best people in the church, one of the most spiritual people in the church, one of the most devout people in the church, a saint, if you will, on a Sunday morning interrupted the service by standing up. I don't know, somewhere after a song, maybe it was after prayer, maybe it was before the special. I don't know.
Yeah.
But they stood up and with tears streaming down their face said, I feel like I need to go to the altar because I've drifted, or I'm not in a place where I need. Well, that's the good shepherd, rescuing the sheep. And I'll never forget that morning because the guy went down and prayed, and guess what? The whole church followed him to the altar.
Yeah.
There was a lot of rescuing that happened that morning.
Yeah, and and that's the perfect illustration again of maybe yet even another attribute. It doesn't start with an R, but it's his faithfulness. It's God's faithfulness to us. But I also thought, as part of the rescue and then the reassurance that, there are many people who, even though God is trying to rescue them, they're having a difficult time trusting him, that he actually is capable of doing that. And this thought hit me. Sometimes I think that is a pride issue, because it's like, who do we think we are that we have done something so big, so huge, that this amazing God cannot take care of it? It feels to me that there's something about the pride of the man involved in that, or the woman,
Right. I think at times people don't forgive themselves, and it's hard when you run it through the lens. And I'm not church bashing at all. I understand the struggle when somebody has fallen to re-accept them. We talked a little bit about that last week, I think. The idea is it's really hard to climb over top of what you see and what you hear from others, and really hear and see what the shepherd is saying. That's a huge part of it. And again, I'm not blaming, not throwing stones. I'm not bitter when I say that. It's just really hard to forgive yourself. I heard a pastor one time say, and this is sort of illustrates getting away from it, that God rescued the 3 Hebrew children in the fiery furnace, and there was not even the smell of smoke.
Yeah.
And then he followed it up and said, I know people that have been rescued for 25 years, and you still smell smoke every time you get around them. And I understand that, because you went through this traumatic experience and you feel like that's all people were thinking about. And in fact, when he rescues you, he does it. He does it well. We won't digress into this, but Peter is an incredible example of a failure who went back to his original job, and Jesus comes searching for him. And in the same fashion, he's fishing, just like it was when he called him the first time. And he didn't put him through a lot of hoops. He asked him, do you love me 3 times?
Yeah.
And then put him right back into ministry. And he's the prominent figure through the first whole half of the book of Acts. He's the guy preaching on the day of Pentecost. He's the guy healing people. He's the guy going to Cornelius' house. I mean, there was no probation. It was the grace, the goodness of the shepherd who said, yeah, you're back. And I want you back, and I've got something for you to do. So.
Yeah. And when we've been rescued, it's not like that's the end all, because as we walk this journey after being rescued, there are going to be a lot of moments when there will be struggles, and that's part of point 2, I think, that you were talking about, the reassurance. And I think, so often through life, we face a lot of temptations, and it's just a part of that Christian walk. I remember a person, Noel Scott, who Cheryl and I had worked with a number of times. I remember one time he said this, that when we face temptation, we need to look at it with a little different perspective. We need to see it that temptation is something that the enemy is using to get back at God. And the only avenue that he has to get back at God is through us. I don't know. For me, that has been a real point of inspiration, because when I think of whatever it is that I'm facing, whatever the temptation, it makes me feel like, man, I don't want to fail God right here. I don't want to give the enemy any territory at all. So
Right. Yeah, that's so true.
just a thought in regard to the reassurance. And then the last point that you had was that of reward. Can you?
Well, so I used it in the sense of a heavenly reward, but I also think it's a daily reward, and you get that out of studying the metaphor of what a shepherd does for the sheep, which we're not going to get into right now. But I think the reward is just daily. It's all the different things, and you can bring up some of the lists that I used if you want, but it's a reward that's daily, because you have, well, let me say that. So I have a book in my hands that I just reordered. I have had it in my library for a long time until I went through my books and had to get rid of a bunch of them. So I reordered it. It's smaller than a Reader's Digest now. I'm not sure how that happened, but anyway, it's a 51-year-old book.
Yeah.
It's by Philip Keller, called A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. And it's a really, really great book, and I wanted to reread it. But here's what he says, and I think this sort of we can go back to that list on the characteristics of a shepherd. This is in the first chapter. He says, "So when the simple though sublime statement is made by a man or a woman that the Lord is my shepherd, it immediately implies a profound yet practical working relationship between a human being and his maker." Just that one line.
Yeah.
The Lord is my shepherd.
Yeah.
I'm human. He's divine. There's so much in that you can't even in that little phrase that you can't even imagine. Daily, God, you're the shepherd. You're leading me. You're healing me. You're valuing me. You're observing me. You're giving me strength. All those things. Those are all rewards daily.
Yeah, and those rewards are all capsulated in one word. It's hope.
Right.
Because that's really the reward, is the hope that we have, not only on those daily issues, but the eternal reward that we have to look forward to.
Isn't it interesting that the language used by God himself to describe the final judgment is that the sheep will be divided from the goats?
Yeah.
You want to be a sheep. You really want to be one of his sheep.
Yeah. You made me think of something else, and it's kind of getting off topic just a slight bit, but this thing about reward, and I know you spoke about heaven, the ultimate reward that we have. I've heard this mentioned a time or two as well. Is it appropriate for us to be motivated to move toward Christ for the reward? You know what I'm asking there?
So, well, I mean, I think that it depends on your situation, Don. It's hard for North Americans, to be honest with you. It's hard for us to think about the reward because we have lived in a society filled with a lot of consumerism, a lot of things to consume. We go to the grocery store. We have 100 boxes of cereal to pick from. On and on and on and on it goes. So it's hard in our context a lot of times, unless you're in poverty, to feel like there's, well, I want to go to heaven, but I kind of want to live my life down here. I can assure you, around this world, there are men and women who love each other, who love God, but their life is so challenged that for them, the idea and the notion of the eternal reward can't come fast enough.
Yeah.
And it's hard because when you get a worldview and you realize how many, besides the fact that we consume 90 some percent of the stuff in the world and the rest are left without, and there's people that don't have clean water. I mean, it just goes down the list.
Yeah.
And they are faithful. They are serving God. They are loving the Lord. He is their shepherd. And I just find it hard to believe that in some way, many of them are not saying what the scripture said, even so come quickly, Lord Jesus, because this earth is not supposed to be a friend to grace. We've been spoiled. We've been sort of lured to sleep, you might say, to lukewarmness, to apathy. We kind of all show up at church and get the check mark, and then we go live our life and do what we do and try to be faithful. But it's not the existence that I think God envisioned for his people.
Yeah.
And when you read the Bible, we'll have more to say about this in another message, but I think when Jesus said to his disciples in that last cram session before he went to the cross, listen, the world's going to hate you. Yeah. They hated me. They're going to hate you. Yeah. They're going to kill me. They're going to kill you. In North America, we don't think that way.
No.
In the world, there are people that face it. So again, now we're moving towards some of that, I think. And I don't want that. I'm not like thinking it's great, but I think it's a real opportunity for revival, a real opportunity for drawing closer to God. I think it's a real opportunity to sort of get our heads on straight and get the kind of view that we need to view the world. And that's a lot, but yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah. Well, man, this was a really inspiring message of hope for sure. Before we leave, have you already put together your thoughts, what you might be looking at for next week?
I have a little bit, but not enough to give you much context. So I'm going to try to, I'm going to try to get more of a message to the church, a little bit of what I just touched on.
Okay.
And that is because I really think that's where pastors have to be today with the uncertainty, the craziness in our world. And we're not to be alarmist, but at the same time, we should be bringing what the Bible really says over and on top what we normally preach. Yeah. And sort of bring that into context now, because those words that are uttered in 1 Peter or in John or in Matthew or the book of John, where it talks about, or Luke, where it talks about things that are going to happen in the end time. I don't know if it's the end times. I just know that there are, again, like there have been in other seasons, there's a lot of things sort of lining up to bring some real discomfort. And if you are following the Bible thoroughly, you are not politically correct.
Yeah. Wow.
In this environment.
I'm sure that's true. Yeah.
And so that brings with it a whole new set of challenges, and it's going to get greater, I believe, in the future. So
yeah. Well, that'll be great stuff to discuss next week. Thanks for taking the time, and I'll see you next week.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks for watching. Take a moment to share with your friends.